Harlequin Special Releases and HarlequinAudio present A Dundee Christmas by Brenda Novak, performed by Amy McFadden. Chapter 1. When the rattletrap truck crested the slight rise that showed Dundee, Idaho, looking stark and barren beneath several feet of snow, Sierra Romero nearly swore. She would have. Those words were the easiest English to remember because she'd even heard them growing up in Guatemala, except she'd promised God that if he got her safely to this town, she'd leave all the bad habits she'd picked up behind. Fudge! You gotta be freaking kidding me! The farmer and his teenage son, who'd brought her all the way from where her last ride had ended, a place called Boise, glanced at each other and started laughing. Sierra lowered her eyelids, but watched them as closely as she could without being obvious. She'd heard that expression a lot since coming to the States. Had she said it wrong? Or was it merely that they had never heard those words spoken with a Spanish accent? She didn't know, but now that they were making fun of her, she was glad she hadn't bothered to listen when they'd given their names. Sierra made it a habit not to grow too familiar with people if she could help it, especially white people. These men would drop her off in Dundee and go to whatever place they'd mentioned. The name had been unintelligible to her, and she'd never see them again. It was better not to get attached to anything. She'd even had to find a new home for the kitten Charlie had bought her when she arrived in Las Vegas, because all her dreams had died when he did, including her ability to take care of anyone or anything she loved. Maybe she'd never been fond of her American fiancé. She hadn't gotten to know him well enough for that. Almost 50 years her senior, he'd chosen her from a bride website, and although he'd brought her to the U.S. more than 2 months ago, he'd spent most of that time in his office, running his business. Still, she mourned him. Maybe he was as perverted as some people, those who disapproved, claimed he was for wanting to marry someone so much younger. But he'd been kind to her, and, with the money he'd sent, generous to the 3 younger sisters who were living on their own in a squalid flat back home, counting on her to provide for them. Too bad he'd had a stroke and died the day before the wedding. If he hadn't encountered some complications with finishing up his divorce, they would have been married right after she arrived, and she wouldn't be floating around America on an expired visa, hoping to find a way out of her desperate circumstances. "Dundee ain't what you expected?" the farmer said. Hadn't she already made that clear? Remembering that she didn't want to upset anyone, that she was living in this country only by the grace of God and would be sent back to utter hopelessness if anyone turned her in, she averted her eyes to hide her flare of temper. She might be as feisty as any Latina princess. At least that was what her parents used to tell her before malaria took them to their graves. But she knew she had to appear somewhat docile if she wanted to get along as a foreigner in such a small community. "It will be fine." "But you don't even have a suitcase." Because she'd had to leave it when she caught the man who'd given her a ride to Salt Lake City hiding behind the building the moment they stopped for gas, using his cell phone when he said he'd be in the restroom. Afraid he was calling to report her, she'd run off, abandoning her clothes, toiletries, and extra money, which were still locked in his trunk. "Someone waits for me," she said, and desperately hoped that was true. Arlene, Charlie's ex-wife, hadn't been the nicest person in the world. She'd stepped in to handle the funeral arrangements and had eventually taken enough pity on Sierra to send her to work for some brother she hadn't seen in years, a brother who lived near this town of Dundee. But Arlene had been the most vocal about her objections to Charlie's plans, and the most unfriendly when Sierra first got to Las Vegas. Sierra had overheard her telling Charlie's neighbor that it wasn't fair he'd toss her out like an old shirt after she'd been with him for so long, just to indulge his pedophiliac fantasies. She said he was too old to father the baby he wanted, the baby she herself had never been able to give him, and that he didn't need to bring in such a young girl to do that anyway. She said he was marrying a baby. "Good, I'm glad you have someplace to go because it's all
Sample complete. Ready to continue?